Okay, good evening, everybody. There must have been thousands of group photographs like this taken during the Great War. Each was an act of commemoration, and the men in the picture would have hoped, when sitting for this photograph, that in the future people would look at it and remember them. But none of them can have expected what happened with this photograph. Over 27 years, I have been in touch with all of their families, and I've looked for every trace of them in the world, made 2 art films, had 2 exhibitions, and I've just published my second book. And in the next hour, I'm going to give an introduction to the project as a whole, using the letters of one man as the main thread of the talk. So firstly, as Simon said, this group photograph is of the officers of the 8th Battalion, Royal Berkshire Regiment. It's taken in their training camp on Salisbury Plain in May 1915. And I came across it when I was looking into my own family history. I knew that my great-grandfather had been some kind of general, and I was pointed to his letters in my parents' loft. And when I read them, I thought to myself, I really need to find out more. And so I booked to go to the Imperial War Museum, and they had the regimental history all laid out for me, ready for my arrival. And as I flicked through, I came to this group photograph. And I'd already had some ideas about First World War group photographs. You just look at them and they are just one moment in time, and they're black and white. And I wanted to turn them, those black and white uniform human beings, into full human beings. And all those questions about what happened to them, who was thinking about them, who was worrying about them, who loved them, and then what happened to them during the war, and for those that survived after the war, and then what did their families think about them now? And I was in the right place to start. I was in the Imperial War Museum library, so I got on and started looking things up. And by the time I realized this was far too many people to be researching, I'd already got hooked, and this was the group photograph that I wanted to do. And my research into the families and trying to find the families took me to all of the counties in England, as well as Scotland, Wales, Ireland, South Africa, America, Canada, Australia. And I contacted people in Switzerland, Hong Kong, Argentina, France, New Zealand, all over the world. And it's been the most incredible experience and a window of looking on humanity. And has led to exhibitions in Flanders Fields Museum in 2015 and at the Forum in Norwich in 2017. I can't tell you in this 1 hour the stories of all of these men. So what I'm going to do is pick one man and tell his story through his letters to a degree. And also along the way, there will be stories from some of the others. So the man I'm picking out is this man, Charles Frederick Napier Bartlett. And by the way, this is my great-grandfather here, William Walton, who's the commanding officer. And in order to find about Charles Bartlett, I'll just give you an idea of what sort of research was involved in the beginning of this. I started in 1994. That was before the internet was in people's homes, and everything was archives and paper records. So I was going to the wills, the probate registry, which then was in Somerset House in London. And I was looking for wills, and I couldn't find a will for him. But in looking through the Bartletts, I noticed he was an executor on a couple of wills, and having got those wills, and there were his brothers were mentioned, all who had the same pattern of names. They had 3 first names with the 3rd name Napier. Also, in looking at the wills, I found that his nephew had gone out to Johannesburg in the 50s. And when I went out to Johannesburg, I was invited out there by the member of one of the other families. I was in the car from the airport with my cousin, and I was telling her about what I wanted to do, and that one of the things was to see if I could find any relations of these Bartletts, and about the 3rd name Napier. And she said, I live on Napier Road, that's got to be a good sign. And so when we got in, the first thing she did was hand me the phone book. And I went through the phone book. There were 2 Bartletts, 3 initials, 3rd initial N. I rang one of them up. He was Charles Bartlett's great nephew, but he had never heard of Charles Bartlett. But his mother was still alive. The great nephew's mother was still alive. And I met them. We had ostrich neck soup, and we chatted, and they put me in touch with someone in the UK who had information which then allowed me to find Charles Bartlett's granddaughter. And I wrote to her and rang her up, and she said, I've got a few letters. You probably won't be interested. They're a bit mundane. I thought, I'm going to be interested. And when I turned up, the few letters turned out to be 341 letters written between August 1915 and March 1917. And they are the most incredible window on a human being and his wife and his place in the First World War, both in the trenches with his men, but also interacting with senior command. And just to give you a bit more background on Charles Bartlett, he was from extremely moneyed background. His father was a wealthy banker in Buckinghamshire, and who died when Charles was 10. And Charles was, obviously it was in trust, but he was basically a millionaire at that age, and contrived to get himself in all sorts of financial troubles despite that. He married, he went into the regular Royal Berkshires just after the turn of the century, and was in for 6 years, and then left. And then it's not quite sure exactly of the sequence of things, but in 1908, he married Margaret, he was 30, she was a 19-year-old West End actress and singer. And they had a daughter, and then, and she was still on the stage when the war started. And he fairly soon signed up and was involved in the formation of the 8th Battalion Royal Berkshires. And you can see here, get an idea of some of the photos that I found from their time of training. They started out top left here. They were in a camp near Cobford in Wiltshire, where they were in tents surrounded by mud, terrible conditions. And then they moved to Reading, you can see here, and this is my great-grandfather taking the salute at in Reading. And then they went down to Salisbury Plain, where there was a permanent camp in May 1915, just before the group photograph. And this is where they did their final training on the ranges. The men only got their rifles and personal rifles, machine guns, 12 days before they got on the train. And you can see bottom right here is my great-grandfather and my great-grandmother waving off the first train. And so we come to the first letter. And just to say, with the layout of the book, I've aimed to include as much as I can of the letters and you'll see how I've done that, but I've wanted to make it a physical experience as if you're opening the letters yourself. So here we go. Dearest, I was very sorry not to see you at station, but never mind, I shall not be away long. 6 a.m, we are just going ashore. I came over with 9 officers, 316 men, all horses, transport, etc. Then the CO took the rest in another ship. Being senior officer on board, I had the best stateroom and dined at 5:30 last night, being asleep by 9:30 and got up at 4:30 this morning with a nice bath. So far, I have not roughed it very much. All our orders were different with regard to embarking when we got to Southampton, which I left at 4 p.m, the others following at 7 p.m. Must stop now, some staff officers coming aboard. All love, thine Charles. And so we have that typical story of people, almost like, it'll all be over by Christmas. I shall not be away long. And it's very difficult to work out how much he was protecting his wife and how much he must have known to a degree what he was getting into, because they would have seen the casualty lists and there would have been the rumor within the army. They knew a lot of what they were getting into. But equally, there was also that optimism of people who've never actually been through it themselves. When they arrived in France, the first thing they did was, well, actually, one of the things was they had no idea what they were going to do. Even when they got on the ships, they thought they might be going out to Egypt. And then they end up in France, and then they go, and the first thing they do is they go and piggyback on other units in the trenches to get an idea of the feel for it. And then by late September, well, actually mid-September, so they arrived in August the 8th, 1915. By mid-September, they knew they were going to be involved in the next big push. And on the right here, here's a letter on the 22nd of September 1915. Dearest darling, we are well on the move, trekked early yesterday morning and slept in a wood last night, moved on early this morning, and are hidden in another wood, which we leave tonight and go up into back line of trenches. From there, we move up in due course. I am just as sick and fed up as muck as I am being left behind with 6 other officers with the transport, the idea being that officers are valuable and all are not to be under fire at once. As I am writing this, Generals French, Douglas Haig and Rawlinson are standing within 100 yards of me. And just to show you, throughout the book, I've tried to research everyone he mentions in the letters. Obviously, these 3 gentlemen are very well known, and their stories are easily seen if you do a tiny bit of research. But I still wanted to include them and also just show that they, like all of us, are human beings with finite spans on this earth. And each person that I've managed to research in the book, and there's 300 people he names in the letters, and I've also researched their families. I've given them a life grid, and you can see it here where each block along here is 10 years, and the red bits are the 2 world wars, and this is the length of their lifespan. And you can see that these 3 didn't actually live for much longer after the First World War. So they were now preparing, and actually one of the things they'd done for a week before this was that my great-grandfather had organized for them to dig a load of trenches that looked like the German trenches that they were going to be attacking. And they practiced for a week before that, and then they were moving up. Here we have the first letter from Charles Bartlett from the Battle of Loos. And again, just to say, this is another thing I've done through the book is I went to the locations and I took pictures of the soil. The soldiers who, you know, if any of you have ever dug trenches and sat in them for a long time, you get very familiar with the soil. and there is a sort of comfort about being next to it. And the different areas you went to, the soil would have been different, and so that is the case through the book. You can see the differences in the soil that they had, and it gives that feel of being there. So that this is the first letter on the first day of the Battle of Loos. Dearest darling, I'm quite safe so far. The show started at 6 a.m. this morning. I joined them tonight. Stileman is wounded, and I hear Ullman, but cannot vouch for it. Hicks, I hear, is bad, and I don't think the regiment has had a very good time. In haste, thine Charles. And in fact, the regiment had not had a good time, and this is his letter 2 days later. The trenches, Monday, the 27th of September, 1915. Dearest darling, just a line to tell you I am still sound in wind and limb. The regiment has had a hell of a time, but has made a fine reputation. As I dare say you guessed from previous letters, we led the assault on our part of the line, and out of 20 officers and 900 men, only 2 officers and 184 men finished up. But we made our objective and took 4 German line trenches, and if others had done as well, we should have gone further on. As I told you, I was kept out of the assault with Edwards, Coote, Spartely, Robinson, Cloak, and we joined up that night, ever since which we have been under heavy fire, which has not done any more damage. Our officers fared as follows. This is the picture of the group photograph at the end of the first morning of the Battle of Loos. The people, the men who are in purple are ones who were left behind in England. They either were kept behind as reinforcements and joined up with the battalion again fairly soon after this, or they went to other units. And then you see the ones in black were the ones who were killed, and the ones in the orange and red one were the ones who were wounded. So if we move along, we've got Breakspear wounded in knee. He had been hit by a shell, his leg was shattered, and even so, as he was being carried off, he was exhorting his men to go and kill more Germans. He ended up in the hospital near Etaples, and his mother and brother arrived half an hour before he died. Ullman wounded. He had been wounded, and then as he was getting ready to be taken to dressing station, he was shot and killed. Hannah, missing, believed dead, reported seriously wounded. He had been killed. Tossetti wounded, not seriously. He had been wounded slightly in the leg, but kept going through the day and wasn't long in hospital and rejoined the battalion fairly quickly afterwards, but would later be killed in the German Spring Offensive. Paramore, missing, no hope. He had been killed. Castle's dead. Berline dead. Peacock dead. Glenn missing. He'd been killed. Rouse wounded. He'd taken a bullet in the arm, and which was broken, and he didn't serve in the trenches again for the rest of the war. Marsh wounded. He had already been wounded, shot in the head in November 1914, serving with the Honourable Artillery Company. And this time he'd been hit in the shoulder, would recover to arrive on the Somme, and he would lead a raid, which after which he was awarded the Military Cross, and then was gassed, and then saw no service in the war, and moved out to Kenya for the rest of his life because his lungs couldn't take the air in this country. Hicks dead. Hobbs missing, believed dead. He had been killed. Haynes missing. He'd been killed. Allen wounded, believed dead. Tom Allen had been shot in the right bicep, right chest, left thigh, and been bayoneted in the right abdomen. And he'd also been gassed and left overnight, but survived, astonishingly survived. And when we had the exhibition at in Flanders Fields Museum in Ypres, I organised a gathering of the families, and there were 135 members of 22 of the families came out for the opening of the exhibition. We went out onto the battlefield at Loos on the centenary day of this action. And I read this letter from Charles Bartlett out to the gathering in a small cemetery on the battlefield. And it is something that will stay with me for the rest of my life, is going through and reading these names and then looking at the families of those names as I was going through. And in particular, the family of Tom Allen. There was his grandson and his two great-grandchildren, Daniel and Greta, who are right just below my feet as I was reading that, and I can feel the tingles on the back of my neck now as I think about it. And they had no right to exist, considering what their great-grandfather had been through on the battlefield at Loos. And back to the letter. Keeble missing, believed dead. He had been killed. Stileman wounded. He'd been hit by shrapnel in the foot and in his back, and even in his 90s, his grandchildren could feel bits of shrapnel in his back, and I will be coming back to him later. Gentry Birch missing, but today found alive with 20 men of his own company attached to another regiment. It has been a ghastly business too awful to describe. We know of no particulars as to how men met their end, as the advance was made under a cloud of smoke and gas. The Camerons, Gordons and Black Watch have been fighting with us, and they are fine men, especially with a bayonet. We have neither washed, slept, and been practically without water for 2 days. It is now starting to rain. I can't write more now, as of course I have a lot to do compiling lists, etc. Besides, I am dead beat. We hope to move out of the trenches tonight to reorganize what is left of us. All love, thine, Charles. And then in a postscript, he says, the Colonel and Lawrence were the only two officers to survive. Both did wonders. So I have been in touch with the families of all of these men. I have researched them in great detail. And as I said, I can't go through them in detail tonight. So I've picked out a few. And here is an idea of the life and the remembrance of William George Hobbs, who was killed at the Battle of Loos. On the right, you can see a family tree that I have done. I came up with this design for this project and for the exhibition. And this tree was part of a vista that was 1 meter high and 34 meters wide in the exhibition, which showed all of their trees. And basically it's a sort of life chart. You can see the dates going up the side from 1812 to the present day. You get an idea of the passing of time by the history of powered flight. So we've got the Wright brothers in 1903, going through the Spitfire during the Second World War, and then amazingly soon after that, going to the moon and then up the top, the International Space Station. You can see going from the first powered flight to going to the moon is a lifespan. So here we have William George Hobbs. He was known as Todd because his father was William George Hobbs and his grandfather was William George Hobbs. So he was Todd, and you can see he was born in 1891, which is the level of the soil here, and then killed in the war. He had one sister who you can see growing out here, who lived into the 1970s. She married but didn't have children, and that tree from his parents died out, basically because of the war. And down below, you can see his parents, grandparents, great-grandparents. You can see that he, on his father's side, his great-grandfather was a house painter. His grandfather was a master plumber. His father was a clerk at a county police court, and he himself was a solicitor. You can see it's sort of in microcosm the progress of Victorian society, that people were able to go from very humble beginnings and have opportunities to get somewhere. I mean, but one of the things you can see from this tree and the fact that it's died out is that when you look at his photo montage, these are all the pictures I've managed to find of him, and they are purely from group photographs and other photographs not from his family, because in terms of contacting his family, I had to go to cousins, and I managed to find a daughter of one of his first cousins who had heard of him but knew very little about him, but passed me on to her cousin, Francis, who was the self-professed family history nut and had done loads of research and pointed me to things, but she didn't have a photograph of Todd Hobbs. And it was, so I shared what I had with her, but she had found out about this memorial stained glass window in the Presbyterian chapel in Richmond-on-Thames that the family went to. But by the time I came along, it had already disappeared because the chapel had to close due to dwindling congregation and leaky roofs and all that sort of stuff. And then in the new chapel, they didn't have room for all of the stained glass windows. So they sold some of them off. And this one didn't get sold whole. The two side bits went to Canada and the central bit went to Japan. And also the other memorials you see here from schools, college, the Law Society, and then this is his parents' grave, and you can see across the top here that it's been split in two and just lying on the ground, broken in Richmond Cemetery. So that's giving an indication of how he was remembered. And then one of the things I wanted to do for the exhibition was, so much of the First World War is seen in black and white or sepia tone, and a lot of the brutality and destruction is just not seen. And I wanted to show the effect of that in color, and also to try and show the complexity of a human being, that we all have bad times, we all have good times, and we're a mix of things, and some of us are remembered more than others for all sorts of different reasons. And I wanted to combine that and I made these stained glass windows, one for each man. And in the exhibition, this was 3 meters high and 9 meters wide for the 46 windows. And just to a lot of it, that it's meant to be mysterious, because each of us has a lot of mystery. I know things about them that I haven't written about, but which there wasn't room to write about them, but I've been able to include them in here in some way, and my thoughts about them from having studied them. And so, for example, there are things like this shield he used to play lacrosse for Middlesex County team. And the background is quite dark because he has, in a large way, been forgotten. But this star here is for Frances, his cousin, who did her best to remember him and helped me. When I met her, she was already undergoing chemotherapy and fairly soon after died. But even so, she gave me some money to help me with my project. And so even though it's in a very abstract way, I wanted to remember her in here. And as I say, I've done this for all of the men in the group photograph. Back to the letters, and the battalion stayed in the Loos area, firstly, they did a second attack at Loos, which was in some ways even more disastrous because it was so unthought out and just such a waste of life. But then they stayed in that area, just manning the trenches, rotating in and out. And this is a letter from March 1916. Dearest darling, many thanks for 2 letters received last night. The most important thing at the moment is, will you please send me out 2 sets of underclothing and a shirt or 2? By the time they will arrive, the warm weather will be here. It was truly a terrible accident that befell me this morning. I was in a sap at 5:30 a.m. this morning. For sap, see illustration. And so here we have the illustration. We have the Boche line, the English line, and the sap, which is the little trench out into no man's land, so that you could have a listening post and understand and try and get an idea of what was going on with the Boche. And the idea being that you had to be, and this is crucial for the rest of the letter, you have to be absolutely quiet, otherwise the Germans would bring fire down on you. So I was in a sap at 5:30 a.m. this morning when I was taken violently short and could not get back to a latrine, with the result there was an appalling accident in my breeches. So when I did get back to the trench, I had to cut off my pants and throw them away. All I had to wash in was snow, but now I've got back to Battalion HQ and had a good wash with hot water and a complete change. I feel better, but I had to cut off the tail of my shirt. With regard to your letter of the 8th, I think you and René must have been drinking very heavily, because I still cannot make out why a rhinoceros is like a centipede. However, it may be that the letters got very wet in transit and the writing was very hard to read. Poor Colonel Graham, commanding Camerons, was killed yesterday by a big shell which just happened to land plumb in the trench as he was walking back from our headquarters to his. The doctor who was with him was blown some distance along the trench, but otherwise than being much shaken, was untouched. The kippers have arrived and were excellent eating, for which many, many thanks. All love, thine Charles. It's just, I mean, there are a few extraordinary letters in here, but this one really takes a biscuit, not just from his personal experience of that disaster in the trenches, but the sort of chopping and changing of different subjects, going from high comedy to horrific tragedy, and then back to the kippers. Yes, there's. But anyway, so that's giving you an idea of the character of the man and the character of these letters. Moving on a day later, just the beginning of letters, it says, just a line to say all's well. We had a quiet night last night, but had no luck this morning. 2 men getting badly hit, 1 killed, and I fear the other won't last long. Well, where possible, I've been trying to find out who these people who he didn't name were. And you look in the war diaries, and a lot of these incidents aren't even mentioned. They're happening so frequently. But with this one, there was only 1 man from the 8th Royal Berkshires who was killed, and his name was George Crawford, apparently. And I found his grave, and I found him in the Commonwealth War Graves Commission records. And with them, he's just G. Crawford, and his number is 18813. And then when I was looking on Ancestry, I found that in the medal rolls, you can see him here with his number and George Crawford. And I was thinking, why is it that the army in their medal rolls have got the full name, and on his grave in the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, they've just got his initial? So I got in touch with the War Graves Commission, and I was told that initially they had the interaction with the army. They got as many records as they could from the army, but they took the decision that they couldn't use those records in the official writing up of each man unless they had corroboration from their family. The reason being that a lot of the men had, there had been a number of men who'd joined up under false names, people who'd joined up underage or false ages. And so by the time, and the thing was, because they were still doing this into the 20s and the 30s, the families sometimes didn't reply. Thousands of families didn't reply. And so they were left just doing what they did with George Crawford. He was just G. Crawford, and that was it. And the thing was, as I'm sure all of you know from doing your own research, the army service records, particularly of other ranks, were a majority of them were destroyed during the Blitz. But also, one thing I didn't realize was that the Commonwealth War Graves Commission had a load of index cards for each man, which, due to a shortage of paper during the Second World War, were all pulped. And they probably didn't realize that the army service records had gone. And so, again, there was another link that was lost. And I've particularly included this little story in here because I just want to acknowledge what the Western Front Association have done in terms of these pension cards that the MOD was going to destroy in 2012, and which the Western Front Association managed to save and digitize. And just as I was doing my final checks of the book, I thought I'd just do some final lookups, and I found these pension cards that come online. And here we have George Crawford, who is not George Crawford. He is Joseph Crockford. And I hadn't, because when I'd been looking in other, Crawford is not a rare name. I hadn't been able to find anyone who fitted the bill in other records. But here we have, firstly, his name as Joseph Crockford. We have his father's name, Charles. We have an address. We also have that he had two elder brothers who were, you can see here, so the two elder brothers are up here, and then that they were both regular soldiers who were killed in 1914. And he actually joined up underage, changed his name, and was still only 19 when he was killed in 1916. So again, moving on, they were in the Loos area until July 1916. And then they suddenly were called down to the Somme on about the 10th or 11th. No, actually it was earlier than that. They started their move down, and they went into action on the 11th of July 1916. And here is a letter even further on. This, even though it says on here 21st of July 1916, this is actually a theme that happens through the letters, is that sometimes you can tell how tired he is by the fact that he gets the dates wrong. This is actually 21st of August 1916. Excuse me. So, dearest darling, this is to wish you very many happy returns of the day, and to hope we shall spend the next one together. Last night we got out of the front line and are now back in reserve, and I doubt very much if we go up again until we are made up again. We lost Bisley, Harrison and Conyers and Joy killed, Stileman, Pitt, Harvey, Prout, Goodship, Sumpster, and a cadet officer who had just arrived and don't know his name, wounded. So I now have 7 company officers left instead of 24, 7 sergeants instead of 32, and 13 corporals instead of 32, and altogether 350 instead of 1,000. So the outlook is not very promising, as God only knows where the officers and NCOs are coming from. However, I suppose with a little sleep, we shall cheer up. The last place was quite the hottest corner we have yet struck. There was no outstanding feature on anyone's part. I am very sorry for Mrs. Bisley, as I think he had only been home once since he was married and was well overdue for leave. I hope you will have received the birthday present all right. Gerard has lost my washing things, but have got another supply. I am now going to shave and wash the first time I have touched water for 5 days. I've also sent for my bath, which I propose to put in a shell hole and have a good wash, but that won't be up until tomorrow. And again, we've got this incredible mix, and you can see on the right-hand side a separate thing where he's wishing his wife many happy returns of the day, in amongst losing most of his men in action. It's just so difficult to get one's head round. Going on to the story of William Bisley, who he mentions here, who he's sorry for his wife. This is the story of William Bisley. You can see him here on his wedding day, and he was the son of a builder in Maidenhead and was socially poles apart from his wife, from his bride, who was the daughter of the local vicar. And when they were children, they sang in the choir together, but they weren't allowed to talk to each other. And it was a story of love at first sight, and they wrote messages to each other and put them in their robes in the vestry. And then as time went on, they found other ways of getting in touch with her. Her father died, and meanwhile, Will also was doing what he could to better himself. He went to teach training college, and then on further to Birkbeck College. And when then the war came and he joined up, they got married in December 1915. He had 2 days leave, which they spent in Torquay. And then he went back to France. He returned for leave in April 1916. And then here we are on the Somme, and he was killed. And Muriel, his wife, had a premonition that he had gone, and she went into labor, and their only daughter was born 4 days after he was killed. And then all these years later, I turned up trying to do this project, and I read about this story in the local newspapers of the time, and I was thinking to myself, I'm going to have to be very careful here. I managed to find Will Bisley's daughter, Betty, and I found that she'd had 4 children, but at that time it was still the ways of finding people's addresses were quite limited, and I couldn't find addresses, contact details for her children. So I thought, well, I've just got to get on with this. So I wrote to her, and then I rang her up, and it had all been a really terrible shock. War was anathema in their house, because not only of this story to do with her father, but also her husband had been very badly wounded at Arnhem in the Second World War, and his brother had been killed in the pursuit into Germany at the end of the Second World War, and she'd also lost a cousin in Burma in the Second World War. And she didn't really want to talk to me, but I said to her that I just wanted for him to be remembered properly as a human being. And she said, okay, leave it with me. And then her daughter and son-in-law came to visit me, and we talked, and I showed them what I found so far, and they showed me some of the family photographs. And then I obviously did okay, because next time both her daughters came to visit me, and this time they brought a 13-page letter from their mother, which told the whole story of Will and Moo and the family, which had never really been talked about in the family. I mean, this is the sad thing, as I'm sure a lot of you know, people clammed up and didn't talk about their experiences of the First World War, and that has led to a collective loss of memory throughout the country, of the reality of what people went through, particularly on an emotional level. And it was extremely difficult for all of us. But in the end, the fact that I'd come along and her mother had written this, that their mother had written this letter, meant that the history got remembered. If I hadn't come along, I wonder whether it ever would have been. And the family stories is just extraordinary, because here we have Will's widow Mew on her 90th birthday, with her daughter Betty in the back here, and Betty's 4 children and 8 grandchildren. And there have since been another layer of 14, and you can see that in the family tree here. And you know, every family tree is different, and you have this extraordinary thing of all of these lives going together to produce lives which they have no idea what they're going to turn into. And each of us, again, in turn, has the power to produce new life. And you see here, Will, killed in the war, his daughter born 4 days after him, and then all of this blossoming, just from having those 2 days honeymoon. And it is just such an eloquent symbol of the power of love, and what can happen with humanity when given the chance. You see and the strange thing in this tree, is that the 2 siblings you can see here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 brothers and 1 sister. The brothers the ones of them who died youngest are the ones with the offspring. You can see these sister and 3 brothers lived longer but didn't have children. This branch, there's a load of these are in Canada, and the others, you know, they're around the world, and I didn't manage to catch up with them. But you get this idea of the amazing regenerative of power of humanity. And you can see here on his photo montage, you can see how he was loved in terms of the keeping of the photographs all the way through his life. There's a memorial font cover in the church in which he was married and where his parents are buried. And it's got his name on, and every time a baby is baptized, he is in some way thought of. And he is on all of these memorials. The most that I found in my research: churches, schools, colleges. Yeah, it's extraordinary. Moving on again, and this is the picture of the group photograph at the end of the war. You can see the ones in black were killed. The ones in green had got severely ill. and were very badly affected by it. So here we have Henry Hewitt, who was a chaplain who got malaria in the Mediterranean on the way to Salonika, but still managed to recover and went on to live to be 80 and have his parish in Hertfordshire. And you've got Teddy Taverner, who was in the trenches and ate an off tin of McConaughey's beef stew and got terrible gastroenteritis that took him out of the trenches. He at the time must have thought it was incredibly bad luck, because he was horrendously ill and in hospital. He couldn't serve in the trenches, but it meant that he didn't serve in the trenches again for the rest of the war. Ended up in the RAF as an admin officer and survived to be 82 and have a son and family. And then you look at these ones in the red who were badly wounded, which affected them through the rest of their lives. And the ones who haven't got any colour on them, it's a mistake to think that they survived completely unaffected. For example, Charlie Watson, he got a disease of the foot, and which was unrelated to his war service, but was there and saw the effects of the battlefield of Loos and never really mentally recovered for the rest of his life. Now he lived into his 80s. And you can see here, this is Charles Bartlett. He survived. I'm afraid I'm going to leave you to have a look at the book to see what the rest of his life was like. But I'm going to pick out Donald Starman, who I mentioned earlier, because his story is one of the things that most inspired me through doing this project, and which still inspires me. And we have him here when he was studying history at Cambridge before the war, and he didn't know really what his life was for. His father was a bishop. He'd signed the temperance statement, but when he got to university, he tore it up, and there was a note in his school magazine which said that Ginger was drinking and sleeping too much and occasionally turning out for the Dodos playing hockey. They're a club at Cambridge. And he was really sort of drifting, just like so many students, just like I did in a lot of ways. And then the war came and he joined up. And as we heard, he was wounded at the Battle of Loos. Just on the eve of the battle, he got shrapnel on his foot and his back, recovered enough to rejoin in early 1916, and then went down with them on the Somme, as was wounded in this attack on the Somme that I mentioned in the letter. He had his ulnar nerve severed in his right arm, and you can see here he's holding his right arm, and it's got a glove on because it didn't have the circulation and to be able to keep it warm. He referred to it ever after as his dud hand, and he never had full of use of it for the rest of his life. But something seemed to have switched in him, having been given the chance of life again. He went and changed from studying history to studying forestry, went out to India, to the Indian Forestry Service, got married, had a son, wanted the best for his son, so came back to the UK and joined the Forestry Service and dedicated his life to forestry and to trees and to his family. He had 4 children, who we can see here, and was an incredibly determined man, even to the extent, and now we're about to see one of my favorite pictures in the whole of this project. This is him, aged 90, 10 feet up a ladder, pruning with only the use of one hand. And in fact, on his 90th birthday, he was given a new bicycle saddle. He was just someone who wouldn't give up. And in fact, his family talk now about one of his sayings being, never give up. And here you can see on one of his birthdays in his 90s with his family, and then his grave says it all. There aren't lots of memorials to him, but there is this one grave, and it says, greatly loved man of the trees. And in fact, whenever I spoke to any of the members of his family who knew him, they glowed with the remembrance of him. And he had taken the life that he had been given by surviving the war and made it count. So to finally sum up about the whole project, I think this is a particularly apposite photograph, which was taken in Dud Corner Cemetery at Loos. And just to pick out a couple of things that I have learned from doing this project. One is that history is important. A lot of the time, I get the impression that there are people think that history is just telling stories and that it's not particularly relevant, that there are more important things in life. But actually, history defines who we are. And that is not only on a personal level, and just to say about the personal level, one of the extraordinary things I think about human existence is the fact that most people do not have a detailed knowledge of the people that made them, going past their grandparents, possibly their great-grandparents, they might know, but the detail of what those people's lives were, even some people don't really know their parents or grandparents, and actually I found a lot out about my parents as a result of doing this project, because I suddenly started asking questions. There's a lot of things you assume and then it's only when the sources have gone and most people start asking the questions late in life when they're not busy earning a living and bringing up a family and all of that, and by that time it's all too late. So one of the things when I go into schools, as I say to the kids, I say to them, go back and ask your parents and grandparents about your history, because you may not think you're interested now, but you will be in later life, and you will thank your younger self if you have asked the questions and written some things down. And likewise, those of the older generation, I say, you may think that your grandchildren are not interested in you and what you've done with your life and what you know about your family. But actually, when they get older, and if they get to their old age and then they retire and they suddenly think, oh, I'm going to do my family history. If you've written it all down, you may not be there anymore, but they will thank you. That anything you can write, it doesn't have to be perfect, it doesn't have to be complete, but something that says who you were, who your parents were, what defined you as a person is valuable. Also, and then the bigger picture of history, that it defines how our society is. There's so many myths and presuppositions about how, say, our country works and what the story of the Great War was. And actually, we need to ask questions and take an objective perspective, because the main thing we need to be learning is how to prevent it ever happening again. And sometimes I think that gets forgotten. And another of the really big things that I learned from doing this project is that anything is possible. I gave a presentation in a school very early on. I hadn't got anything prepared, and someone asked me, what was this project all about for you? And I'd remembered as I was going into the hall to give my presentation, there were these inspirational notices on the lockers, and one of them was anything is possible. And I thought, actually, that is it. Because not only does that apply to these men in terms of bad things happening and the war happening, so most of them had comfortable existences that they thought they were just going to replicate what had happened to their parents, and that they would get married and have children and have a good job and make money and enjoy life. Suddenly they were knocked out of that by the First World War, and their lives were changed forever. Some permanently, killed, that was it, and others having to live with it and the memory of it for the rest of their lives. But also, on the other side of things, amazingly brilliant things can happen when you think that all is lost. You are in the pit of despair. And I like to think of Donald Starman on the battlefield of the Somme, having been wounded in the arm. His comrades are all around him, being wounded and killed, and shell fire coming down and machine gun fire, and just thinking, he must have been thinking, I am never getting out of this alive. And at that point, he was 22 years old, and he lived to be 94 and have 4 children and make his difference in the world. And so what I would say to you is, whatever period of life that you're in, whatever situation you're in, anything is possible. You can make things happen. And if something burns inside you that you think you can make your difference, then get on with it, because anything is possible. And that is the main part of my talk, but just to also talk about the books that are at the background of all this, in terms of the exhibitions don't exist at the moment. I would love to be able to put on an exhibition somewhere in this country, but the thing that is tangible is these books, which the first one was produced by the museum, and I had no idea about the book trade and brought some back from Ypres, and I was trying to get noticed and was getting nowhere. And then I put a despairing plea out to my friends, and one of them was a childhood friend of Jeremy Vine, and mentioned it to him, and was still in touch with him, and mentioned it to him. And somehow I managed to convince his researcher that it was a good idea. I went on for 10 or 15 minutes on the 8th of December 2015, and came away thinking that I hadn't really got across what I wanted to say. But I checked my email after an hour after being on the show, and I'd sold 600 books. And by the end of the day, I'd sold 1,600. And by the end of 10 days, I'd sold 3,500. And when I went on the show, I only had 1,100, and I had to get books coming back over from Belgium. I had to organize reprints at Christmas. I had to email 3,000 people, and all on my own. And, luckily I had some friends who hooked me up with businesses that could help me out. But I was the one who was handling all the email. And in the end, I've now sold 7,000 copies of that book. And then the second book came out in November last year. And you can see what people have been saying about that. And I've now sold nearly 3,000 of that. But it's an incredibly difficult business doing it on your own. It's very expensive producing such high quality, full color books. And the book trade doesn't make it easy. So I would be delighted if you would like to explore further and buy my books. And thank you very much for listening. And I'm looking forward to your questions.
Andrew, thanks very much indeed. That was fantastic. Having read both books, I can attest to the fact that you were just scratching the surface there with some of the stories of the individuals. Could I ask everyone, please, just in the usual way, just use the raise hands button at the bottom of your screen by way of an applause. I don't know if you can see it on your screen, Andrew, but we'll get, well, there's 200 and odd people raising their hands by way of applause. It's quite interesting, Andrew, that you referred to the fact the pension cards that the WFA saved and what a help it was, and in particular the one you showed, which had an alias on it. You may or may not know, but for the last 12 months, the WFA has been running a project called Project Alias, where we're trying to make sure that those cards that show an alias are indexed properly so people can find their relatives under either name. And just to let the people watching know that we are running another version of Alias at the very moment on the cards for the other ranks that survived. So if you want to help us with that, and you can see from Andrew's testimony what value it provides to researchers, get in touch with us, details on the WFA website. So just bear with me, I'm now going to bring up some questioners. Frank Heron is going to be the first one. If you just get yourself ready, Frank, just...
This has been fantastic. I really, I'm here in Massachusetts in USA, and really very, very inspired with your handling of the concept of the group photo. I was struck with the letter that from 27 September with the detail, the name and names of the people, and so died, so-and-so was wounded. That struck me because there was such strict censorship on American soldiers that I can't imagine, you know, something with that information. And was the BEF lighter on censorship with that, or was it a time of war, or just a special circumstance?
What it was, I think, was that he knew that censorship existed, and he was a senior enough officer that he wasn't actually being censored himself.
Okay, he was a censor.
So, but the thing was that he knew that there were certain things that he couldn't say.
Yep.
So he couldn't write locations, and although his way of censoring himself on that sometimes was quite hilarious. So there was one letter where he says, "I can't tell you where I am, but if you look at the letter, you will get it." And then he's underlined the capital letters of certain words which spell the name, which is saying, it's implying that Germans are stupid and can't you know, read that. But a lot of it was the fact that I think they knew the letter of the law of censorship, or he knew the letter of the law, but thought, actually, you know, I just have to do it so I don't get caught. Rather than thinking what was the reason for having the censorship. And actually, one of the particularly significant things about these letters is the fact that they are virtually uncensored. There's only one that has got any blue pencil on it. And as you say, you know, you've got all the names, you've got all the and you also get an indication of his morale, all of these sort of things, which, you know, even if the Germans didn't get the letter, his wife talking in society in London and other people hearing that's significant.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Wonderful job.
Thank you.
Thanks for your question, Frank. Okay, I'm going to bring up Nicholas Bennett now. If you want to unmute and ask your question.
Well, first of all, can I say what an excellent book it is? I read the review in the Sunday Times and immediately sent off for it, so I recommend it to anybody. The question I wanted to ask, and whilst we were having the discussion, I googled Mr. Crockford's address at 197 Mail Road in Herne Hill, and it still exists. And I was wondering whether you would sort of Google Earth the houses all these people lived in, because that always gives some idea of their standing in society, etc.
It's not actually something I've done. I mean, I have to be honest that when I was doing the majority of my research towards the exhibition, it was really rather, it was certainly pre-Google Street View and that sort of detail on Google Earth. And then when I was working on this book, I sort of set the bar lower in terms of the research that I was doing, because there were 300 people that I was researching, and it depended if I sort of had a sniff of a story that there was something I was missing and that I thought there was something extra, then I would do the extra mile. But certainly, I mean, it's that sort of thing. I mean, when I was doing the research for my first book, there were, on the men in the group photograph, I actually went to their houses, because there wasn't anything online at that point. I actually had to physically go there. And there was one where I was despairing of actually finding his family, and I found the last house that he lived in, and I knocked on the door, and the people who lived there then gave me enough clues to be able to find his family. So, yeah.
Interestingly, though, it can be quite a job, because I lived in a little road in southeast London, and I discovered that Brandon Jones VC was born in the same road as me. Of course, the road had been completely altered, and what was number 7 had now become number 36.
Right.
So it does take some research with electoral registers, etc. That's another, of course, good source is electoral registers.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, I made a lot of use of them when I was trying to trace the families. And then again, at that stage, you had to physically go to the local district libraries and look in, and then the electoral registers weren't alphabetized, and you had to know an address in order to be able to look and see what the people were there. But yes, I mean, with Charles Bartlett, I did that with a house that he wrote most of the letters to. That doesn't exist anymore, but there is still a 161 Haverstock Hill, which is an estate agent's now. So,
Nicholas, thanks very much for your question.
Thank you.
The next person is Carolyn. Now, before Carolyn asks the question, I'd just like to acknowledge that it was Carolyn working together with her on one of the WFA projects last year who first brought your book to my attention when she heard you on Radio 4.
Yeah.
So I'm glad Carolyn's here.
Yeah, thanks. And that was really, really interesting. I will say that I persuaded my children to buy these 2 books for me for Christmas.
Brilliant.
But I haven't seen the children, so the books are still waiting to be read when we can get together again. But I was going to ask you, you must have a massive information and records apart from what's in the books. Have you got any ideas about what might, where you might deposit it, as it were? Have you got an archive in mind that might be?
Well, I've already given the Regimental Museum in Salisbury. The wardrobe is it's now the Rifles, but it's the Regimental Museum for both the Wiltshires and the Berkshires, and they've got several discs with a lot of material. I mean, it's difficult because some of the material I went to the families and they allow me to copy a lot of stuff. But and any things that I were using, particularly the more modern day things, I got specific permission to use in the book. And I couldn't just give all of their stuff to the Regimental Museum. So I sifted through and picked it more the military stuff from them. And I can't remember in terms of the details of the family trees and all that sort of stuff, how much I've given them, but I have been giving them. And it is something I've been thinking about recently in terms of whether I should be depositing like my artworks that I've made, whether I should be going to the V&A Museum has an art library, whether I should be depositing things there, and the British Library and all that sort of stuff. It's a difficult business because there are all of these sensitivities attached to. I mean, it's been one of the biggest issues through this whole project, is how do you deal with the fact that this is about living human beings who have a right to privacy, but on the other hand, we also as humanity need to learn stuff, and you can't just, if you just leave it until everyone's dead, we learn stuff 100 years behind the times. So yeah, it's an interesting question, but a difficult one.
Yes, well, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Carolyn. Adrian, I'm not sure if Andrew covered your question there, but do you want to pose your question?
Yeah, hello, good evening, Simon and Andrew. Thank you very much, Andrew. That was really enlightening. So can I ask a couple of questions, if I may, then,
yes,
Andrew
sure.
and Simon? It's just interested in your background, Andrew. Are you a teacher, or what's your professional sort of background?
My professional background. I did a chemistry degree. And when I was at university, I was in the Officer Training Corps, and went on to be commissioned in the TA, and I was with I went on to be Regimental Signals Officer of 351 Highland in Scotland, in Stirling. I have a very checkered career in terms of employment. That I did various things connected with chemistry and industry, then computing, but I underneath it all, I realized I wanted to be an artist, and I had been before, but I'd just been brainwashed at school that was not a way that you make a career. And likewise, I gave up history at 14 because I just, it would have been told, you're not going to, that's not a way to make a career. And then, so what am I? I'm a historian and artist. And okay, I haven't, it's very difficult to make a life out of it. And I've been very fortunate that I came into some money at a certain point, and have had huge support of my parents. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been able to do this. And I worked in my local library for a long time up here. But basically, I am now a historian and artist, and trying to work out how to get people to connect into what I've done.
Excellent. Okay, thank you. The other sort of part, the other part of the question was: have you tried to hold an exhibition at the Royal Berkshire Regiment? But I think it's all part of the National Army Museum now, isn't it? Have you tried to have a? Well,
the Royal Berkshire Regiment are part of the Regimental Museum down in Salisbury.
Okay.
They don't. A lot of the regimental museums have nearly no funding. They certainly don't have any central government funding, as far as I know, and they're run on a shoestring, and they don't have the space to do my exhibition. I mean, my exhibition in the Cloth Hall in Ypres was in the Royal Hall within the Cloth Hall, which was 2 full tennis courts in size, and it's a big thing. And the museum over there spent 130,000 euros putting on my exhibition, which included producing the book and the development costs and so on. And doing a new exhibition wouldn't cost nearly that amount. Okay. But still, you need the space to be able to do things. And actually, I did have a meeting in between the first and second lockdown last year. I had a meeting at the National Army Museum about the possibility of doing an exhibition there. But they are, who knows what's going to happen there, because the pandemic has hit them, just like every museum is really going to struggle to do anything.
Yeah. Okay. So just funny, I absolutely agree about the history being important. We've got obviously a certain amount of people who are perhaps trying to sort of take or reinvent history, should we say, on that's subject for another day. But I actually agree with you about the finding out about your grandparents and your great grandparents. And our family, we're doing a lot of research behind the scenes at the moment. So perhaps another day we can talk about sort of hints and tips on. Because one of the problems I have is there's so much information out there. It's how do you put all the pieces into some sort of coherent order? And also you've obviously got to develop the knack for that. And I love that family tree idea. So I'm going to borrow that at some stage as well. Yeah. So I won't ask any more questions, Simon, in the interest of time. But thank you again, Andrew. Sorry, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Adrian. Thank you very much. I was going to bring up a question from Jane Graves, but she's left the webinar at the moment. But I will ask her a question. She wanted to know what your next project might be.
I have actually started some research on something else, but I'm going to keep it close to my chest at the moment because it's very speculative, and I'm not quite sure where it's going to lead to. So I hope you don't mind if I just keep it to myself at the moment.
Okay. I don't think there's any more questions, but I don't know if you can see them. I'll just very quickly, we've had a lot of things coming in saying, where would we be without people like you? You know, thanking you for your work. What a superb talk, remarkable achievement, ingenious, unique, so cleverly crafted, timeline brilliant. One of the most profound presentations I've ever seen, thoroughly enjoyable. Appreciate your suggestion that we get to know our grandparents, the generations, blah, blah, blah. Steve Scott in Canada asked if you're in any relation to Professor John Tatham in Toronto.
Well, the likelihood is probably, but I must confess I don't know him. Though certainly he's not a close relation because I'm the only Tatham of my generation. I'm the only male Tatham of my generation going back to my possibly great grandfather. Mostly because both of my Tatham great uncles were killed in the First World War.
Okay.
But the family name comes from the village of, well, they'd call it Tatham up in Lancashire, and so anyone who's a Tatham will, you know, going back through the centuries is probably related in some way.
Okay, just bear with me. Someone's asked me to put them on. I don't know what the question is, but let's just bring them in. We're just bringing in Gordon Holmes, who's asked if I can do that.
Fascinating subject. Really enjoyed it. I've been doing a similar thing myself with just as an amateur, though, completely as an amateur since I retired. Doing a similar thing with the West Riding Regiment in Yorkshire, the people in Bradford, right. And they're not all on a photograph. I have a couple of these photographs, as you say, these of men, but the ones I've got are just individuals who fought and died whilst fighting in the Great War with the West Yorkshire Regiment, and I've been doing it simply by, I've got a medal and I just took his name, a medal I found, I took his name off the side, and he lived in Bradford, and I got lots of information on him. I went to where he lived. He'd lived in 5 or 6 different places, and a couple of his houses were still up. I found out that he went to school at Hanson School in Bradford, and my wife's great uncle also went to that school. They lived 100 yards apart, 200 yards apart. They were both killed in France, and they're both buried in Etaples Military Cemetery, about 200 yards apart. So when I'm doing this as an amateur, I'm well to what I've worked all my life, and I just do this, and I just want to say what you do is fabulous, fantastic.
Thank you very much.
All you have to do is just pick a medal up. I've got a couple of death pennies like this. I've got young lads, a lad called John Fretwell on my wall. I've researched him. I've got his medals. I've got his death penny. I've got his regimental cap, badge and shot. Not his original, but to the regiment. And I've actually, he didn't have any children. He were dead at 18. But I've contacted his brother's family and got their grandchildren. and they're going to come and see this. They don't know how it's gone out the family, but when they come to Yorkshire. So
well,
what you doing?
That's the thing when you start getting involved in that.
Ancestor did it for me, but it takes your life over.
Yeah, but also there's things that you don't anticipate. So the thing, you know, most families are not all together and happy with each other, and you find things that have escaped the family and trying to work out why. And some people are not at all happy about that and all that sort of stuff. It can be a difficult thing to navigate.
You're right in what you say. You should ask the questions now or when you're younger, because I'm trying to find out things. And my mother had 17 brothers and sisters.
Oh, wow.
We've got one left, and he can't remember his own name, never mind where he lived.
Oh, right.
And it's difficult.
Thanks for your contribution.
Sorry, Simon.
No, I'm going to have to wind this up now because we're actually running out of time. But thanks for your contribution.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you very much, Gordon.
I won't read the rest out. There are a lot more comments about inspirational talk, etc. So can I just ask people who are left? We've still got more than 200 people on the call. Just raise your hands again by way of a thank you, please. And can I just remind you that the books, if you're going to buy the books, which I urge you to do so, they're marvellous books, you can get all the details from Andrew's website, which is groupphoto.co.uk.
Thank you, Simon.
That's okay. So that's it for tonight. Fantastic talk from Andrew. We've got more talks coming up. All the details on our website. On Thursday, we've got Ian van der Barg talking about the war in South Africa, the mobilisation in 1914. And then on Monday, we've got Andrea Hetherington talking about deserters on the home front. But for now, that brings us to a close for tonight. Thank you once again to Andrew. If you want the final word, Andrew?
Well, this is my first Zoom talk, and I think you've handled it brilliantly. So thank you very much, Simon, and for organising it all for me. Thank you.
My pleasure. It's down to Carolyn, who was one of the questioners, and Charlie, my daughter, who bought me the second book for Christmas. So I'll be in touch on email, Andrew. So thanks again, and thanks and good night to everybody.
Good night. Thank you.
All right. Take care now. Thank you.
Mademoiselle from Armentières, parlez-vous. Mademoiselle from Armentières, parlez-vous. Mademoiselle from Armentières, she hasn't been kissed for 40 years. Hickey, picky, parlez-vous. Out on kicking Armentières, parlez-vous. Out on kicking Armentières, parlez-vous. Out on kicking Armentières, broke the spell of 40 years. Hickey, picky, parlez-vous. The officers get all